Probably the most moving travel experience of my life was travelling to Japan, and specifically travelling to Hiroshima, going there to look at a city that was devastated by an atomic bomb back in 1945. To go there, to visit the museum, to go to the Peace Park, to listen to the stories of A-bomb survivors, changed my life. You go in the Peace Park, and one of the things that you see there specifically is a monument to a little girl, Sudoka, who was only 2 years old at the time that the A-bomb was dropped. She was thrown out of the bedroom window of her parents' house, and yet somehow she survived, and her parents survived despite only being 2 miles from the epicenter of the bomb. She recovered. She went back to school and became quite an athlete, a very good runner, very good sprinter, and she was enjoying life. She was representing her school nationally in sprinting until she was 11 years old and diagnosed with leukemia. A lot of children at the time suffered from the same problem. She ended up in hospital, and in her hospital bedroom, one of her friends came in to see her. She had a sheet of paper and she started folding an origami paper crane. Cranes are a symbol of luck within the culture, the tradition of the Japanese. And this little girl got the idea in her mind that if she folded 1,000 paper cranes, that she might survive, she might be healed. She never got up to that number 1,000. But school friends and then schools across Japan kind of caught the vision, and other children helped fold those paper cranes, and it became something of a symbol that this must never happen again. The memorial was built because school children, not just in Japan but in other parts of the world, heard this story and raised funds to put a monument to this little girl, to share her testimony, her experience, and to say, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these 2 towns must be the only towns where an A-bomb is ever dropped. To go there and to meet witnesses, to meet survivors. I met 2 survivors there. I met Mrs. Kino and Mrs. Sako. When I met them, they were 87 and 77 years old. But Mrs. Sako was only a 17-year-old schoolgirl in August 1945. And she, along with other youth in the city, had been seconded by the military to help in demolishing buildings to make a fire break in a city that was principally built out of wooden houses. And that's exactly what she was doing when a few planes flew over the city, but for some reason didn't drop any bombs. And then she heard the noise of one solitary plane.
I started walking beside the military school. It was a summer day, so I was holding my parasol and had my jacket on my other arm. I heard a little humming noise, a little low noise in the distance. At that moment I looked up. I saw a great flash, a mixture of blue and orange, just flashed in front of my eyes. It was the atomic blast, and I was less than 1.5 kilometers away from it. I saw the light, but I didn't hear any sound. I was thrown right up into the air over the top of a 2-meter-high wall and landed on the ground in a small space between the wall and a water tank. I tried to see where I was, but all was total darkness. I thought I had taken a direct hit. I thought I was blind. I didn't know how many hours afterwards, but I saw what seemed like dim light, and I started crawling out of there. All the soldiers and the men that were there at the time of the blast were gone. The houses were just flattened. There was nothing. I crawled over the rubble and tried to make my way home. When I got near, I saw my mother standing, but she had no shoes on, and her face was bleeding. The house was flattened, but somehow I crawled under and found her some shoes. Then I asked where my father was, and she said next door. When he came, we decided to head towards a park by the river. On our way, we saw a soldier supported by a group of nurses, but the nurses were so blackened and damaged with such singed hair, it was hard to tell if they were male or female. But soundlessly, with dangling limbs, they marched toward the river with us. We found a cherry tree and decided to stay under it. My skin was very, very dry, but I did not seem to be bleeding, so I tried to help some of the others, even though I didn't have my first aid kit. Then it started to rain. Big black drops full of radioactive material. By that time I was finding it hard to breathe. I was really starting to struggle. I thought I was going to die, but somehow I wanted to continue living. I was choking. Then I passed out. I must have fainted. Gradually I started to hear the sound of the water, the rain that was both helping and killing me, and the warmth of the sunshine. I regained consciousness, but then found the burns were starting to show through, on the hand, my arms, my neck, also on my face, but particularly my ankles. Where parts of my skin had been exposed to the blast were severely damaged. They started to ooze pus and fluid, and the burns on my forehead oozed over my eyes, that were already bad from the explosion, so I could not see anymore. The military set up first aid posts on the edge of the city, not down in the centre, and my father carried me to them. At each one, the soldier said, "We are busy helping the survivors who have more of a chance. Your daughter does not have a chance. We can't care for her." A few days afterwards, I was put in one of the remaining buildings. My arms, my face, everywhere was oozing with pus, and what made it worse was the maggots would feed on the pus. A thin layer of skin would start to heal, but you could still see the maggots underneath. The doctor would have to cut the skin to remove the maggots. It was so painful. I would try not to cry, but it hurt so much I would bite my lips and almost bit them off. It hurt so much. Many things happened. My beautiful long hair fell out. There was blood in my bowels. After 3 weeks, I managed to stand up and go out. I was surprised. There were so many deformed people, people without a nose or an earlobe, people who cannot sleep because there is so much broken glass in their body. Many people with many problems. My father originated from a little bit further away on the other side of Honshu Island in the countryside, so 3 months later we evacuated ourselves there. When we arrived at the station, the scene was wonderful. Blue sky, mountains so green, and a crystal clear brook. It was so peaceful. We had had 8 years of constant war. This looked so peaceful. I just cannot forget the contrasting scene. Since then, I really dislike war. I hate war. I really don't want my children to experience what I experienced. I really tried to do my best to prevent the thing that happened.
Mrs. Sarko is a lovely lady and full of absolute Japanese hospitality, and she had brought a book to the interview. She wanted to give me that book, but it was a book that was clearly very, very precious to her. It was a book that had been written by survivors, a book of poetry. On the left-hand side, the poem was there in Japanese. On the right-hand side, it was there in English. And it was very moving, just leafing through that book, looking at the poems. And it was too precious, even with the traditions of Japanese hospitality, to take that book from her. And so through an interpreter, I said to her, "Look, I'll take some photographs of the book, and the memory will go back to England, and you are able to keep the book yourself." But let me share with you just one of those poems. Heaps of schoolgirls lying in refuse, pot-bellied, one-eyed, with half their skin peeled off. The sun shone, and nothing moved but the buzzing flies in the metal basins, reeking with stagnant odour. How could I forget the stillness prevailing over the city of 300,000? Amidst the calm, how can I forget the entreaties of departed wife and child, through their orbs of eyes, cutting through our minds and souls? What a moving poem. But then how do you cope with events like this? Near the Ninja Castle in Kyoto, I met two nuns. They're from Thailand, and they told me of their visits to the killing fields in Cambodia. And, you know, you can look around all sorts of parts of the world and you can see sorrow and disaster multiplied. Kosovo, Somalia, all these different parts of the world. How do we cope with situations like that? Even in Hiroshima, how do you cope? Because after I'd met those two ladies, I went to the museum, to the Peace Museum. And you go around there, there's a monument there. Well, it used to be a statue outside the post office in the centre of the town. And they've brought that monument into the museum, and you can see a mark there where somebody was sitting when the bomb was dropped. And that's all that's left of that person, the shadow of their body, stopping the monument getting darker and more disfigured. And you go round and you see the different displays and you listen to the stories and you see the photographs. And I have to tell you, I had some recording equipment in my pocket for recording the interviews I was doing, and I could feel that equipment throbbing against my thigh, and I thought, that's really strange because this equipment doesn't throb. And I pulled it out my pocket and it was switched off, and I realised it was my blood pressure had risen so much just going around that museum and listening to it. And I was very fortunate that I'd got a Japanese historian friend of mine with me, and he was explaining things to me and giving more background to it. But you know, that night I just couldn't sleep. Having listened to the two ladies' stories, having gone around the museum, and having seen the devastation that humanity can do to each other, and listening to the background of the stories, listening even from my historian friend, and quite clearly displayed in the museum now, the argument that that bomb never even needed to be dropped, that the principal purpose of the Allies in dropping that bomb was not really to bring the war to an end a few weeks earlier. It was to say to the Russians, don't you join in. We've already got the Cold War starting over there in Europe. We don't want Russian soldiers landing on Japanese soil. And it was basically to say to the Russians, we've got the atomic bomb before you have. And it's all there in the archives now, and you can read the stories. And yet there wasn't a sense of anger. As I went around the museum and as I talked, there was certainly a sense of sadness, but there was principally a sense of we mustn't let this happen again. And so with my blood pressure high and with all of those thoughts going around in my brain, I needed to cope. I coped by jumping on a tram and heading for a half-hour journey down to the coast, where we could then take a ferry across to the nearby Hiroshima Island. There's a shrine there, a world-famous heritage site, one of the top 3 attractions in Japan, a Buddhist shrine founded in 593 AD. But it's really a place of tranquility. You're surrounded by nature there. They have deer there, which are also considered to be holy, and those deer are so holy that they will eat anything that you give them, and you have to keep your paper and your bags and everything close to you. But the beauty is you go round there, and then as you climb up the hillside to the top of what they see as a holy mountain. And there's one thing you have to say for the Buddhist religion. They put their shrines and their temples in stunningly beautiful places. And just being in that atmosphere, even though I'm a Christian and have a totally different mindset, to be there in nature just helped to calm me down, to think of my God, and the thing that my God is a God of peace equally helped to calm me down and restore my equilibrium. How does Hiroshima do it? Well, it copes by working for peace, and it does it in many ways. It does it with the Peace Museum. It does it with the Peace Park. It does it with letters of protest from the mayor every time a nuclear device is detonated or tested somewhere in the world. And I wanted to find out more about that, so I went to visit the city council, and more specifically, I went to visit the mayor's office. Hiro Sakata works in the mayor's office. He was deputy director of the Hiroshima Peace Foundation.
This organization is founded in 1982 when Mayor of Hiroshima then made a speech at the special session of disarmament at the United Nations in New York. And in that statement, Mayor of Hiroshima encouraged cities all over the world to make solidarity toward peace. Now we have more than 600 membership from more than 100 countries. So I might say it is a kind of worldwide network of local authorities which are aiming at world peace through the intercity solidarity.
Among those cities are indeed cities here in Britain and the UK, and really I can understand why Hiroshima is doing it. There's a strong sense of we mustn't let this happen again. And yet, as Christians with our biblical understanding, we know that in the end of time, before Jesus comes again, he prophesies that there would be wars and rumours of wars. And while we work for peace, and that's admirable, and for myself, I absolutely, totally, fully support it, there's got to be something more. And that brings me back to our two ladies, Mrs. Kino and Mrs. Sarko. Both of them have become Christians and actually have become active members of the Hiroshima Seventh-day Adventist Church. Both of them work for the peace movement. They tell their story to school children. But both of them have something more. I asked Mrs. Sarko about how faith came into her experience.
With an event like this, everything changes. The ecosystem, the world around me. But I thought there must be a thing that never changes. I married when I was 21. That was risky, as you do not know what may happen to the baby of an atomic bomb survivor. But I married, and when I had my son, he was okay, and I started to think about him. I looked around different religions, Catholic, Protestant, as well as our traditional Buddhist and Shinto religions. Eventually, a former classmate of mine invited my mother to an evangelistic series. My mother didn't go, but I did, and it was in those meetings that I found a thing that does not change. Everything around me may change, but I believe in a God who does not change.
Where does your faith come into this? When you listen to that story, when you hear about a God who does not change. That's a remarkable statement for a lady who's gone through the trauma that she has, and then who's joined a minority of a minority, because less than 1% of the population in Japan are actually Christians. And then we need to ask, how does that fit in to our own situation? The God who does not change. What are his characteristics? What allows you to be at peace with him, even in a world that's not particularly peaceful? There are many Bible verses that we could quote that talk about this kind of subject, but here's one I find that encourages me. It's Psalm 139, and I'll just read the first 4 verses. O Lord, you've searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. Now, that could be really scary, to think that there is a God up there who knows our every thought, who knows everything we're going to do. Because face it, if I'm doing some bad things and I know there's a God up there that's watching and sees that, I'm damned. But on the other hand, it can be good news, because this is the God that is watching my life. This is the God who understands me. This is the God who sees the struggles that I'm going through, and he's blatantly saying there, I know your goings out and your comings in. I know the good times that you're having. I also know the struggles you're having. And to be honest, most of us have never had to go through anything like Mrs. Kino or Mrs. Sarko. We haven't had to live with the fear of cancer or leukemia because of the devastation of having that kind of bomb dropped on us. We haven't been there in hospital in the terrible situation that they went through. And yet they can come and say, I know a God of peace. And if for them it's good news, for me it must be good news as well. To know that God can help me through the difficult times and through the troubles that I may go through. Towards the end of the psalm, it says, Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. No offensive way in me. You know, that one is really quite hard. How can your relationship with God be one where you say, God, if there is something wrong with me, then work it out. If there's something wrong in my relationships with those around me, help me work it out. I've got a wife that's very good at that because, you know, sometimes I have a terrible sense of humour, and sometimes I stand at the front in a church and I say something I shouldn't, and she'll say, Victor, you shouldn't have done that. And that can be painful because you think, why not? People should understand the way I am. And then you have to work it through. And that's important. And I'm grateful I've got a wife like that can help me in my relationships in that way. But how do we work it through? When we're in a situation that's anything but peaceful, how do we come to that peace? How do we take those words of Psalm 139 and make them our own? It's a very hard question, and it's one that I needed to ask Mrs. Sarko with all the horror that she's gone through. Where does forgiveness fit in?
Definitely, I think my faith taught me forgiveness. My father was a Buddhist, and it is the atomic bomb that led me towards Christianity. I asked my father if I could become a Christian. My father said, well, yes, Christianity teaches love, Buddhism teaches compassion. There is no objection to me. Since then, I have been attending church. The first time I went to church after the evangelistic series, the subject was Genesis. I fell in love with the story of Genesis, of creation, and especially the idea that we are special, that we are in God's image. That makes all people special to me. That encourages me. I really treasure that God is my friend and the church is a support.
Special words, that, isn't it? Coming to know God, coming to know the God who created me, that made me in his image, to know that God is my friend, that the church is a support. Those are the things that were special for Mrs. Sarko. For a lady that took the risk as an A-bomb survivor to have children and to be blessed by the fact that those children were normal, that was something special for her. To then discover by reading the Bible, even though she came from a different faith background, but to read through the Bible and to see this God created me and I am special. To go through the Bible and then to see not only is this God special and believing that I'm special, this God died on a cross for me. And everything that I went through in Hiroshima, this God went through more on Calvary. And so it's a real challenge for her, and she sits there in an old folks' home, in a very special old folks' home, because the Japanese government went out of their way and supported by the Americans and others to have special homes for these survivors where they can sit and tell their story to school children. And her story is special because she is a survivor. But she is a survivor that has found Jesus. And because she has found Jesus, she has found forgiveness. It would be very easy for her to be very strongly anti-American, because it was an American plane that dropped the bomb, to be anti-British with me sitting there and interviewing her because we were part of the allies that they were at war with, to be anti all sorts of people that had caused so much devastation. If her country had agreed to surrender a week, even a day earlier, she wouldn't have had to go through that experience. But she learnt forgiveness. And I have to say, while this journey to Hiroshima was emotionally very moving for me, the lesson I learnt of forgiveness there was very, very important. You know, there's a school friend of mine when I was, I guess, 16 years old that did something that hurt me. And I went for years not forgiving him. The day I did, I felt a weight come off my life. And that's tragic, isn't it? You know, to go from age 16, maybe up into your 30s, harbouring a grudge about what somebody did when you were a teenager. These two ladies, 17 years old, and a bomb dropped on them, and they survived, holding no grudges but saying, I forgive. It's fine. My God is a special God. My God is a God who forgives. If he could work forgiveness in their lives, he's certainly made that transformation in my life. And if he's done it in my life, he can do it in your life too. And together with forgiveness as Christians, surely we can then make a difference in our communities. Forgiveness is really the only way forward. It's the way that makes a difference. And I challenge you, because I've seen the difference in my life. I've seen the difference with these two ladies, and I know you can see the difference as well.